everyone, welcome back to Oz and Elsewhere. And today I'm going to be reviewing the International Booker Prize winner, Taiwan Travelogue. A spoiler alert, I thought this book was excellent. I regret not reading it sooner, and if you haven't read it yet, I think you will regret not reading it sooner. And here's why. So there are a few things I really loved about this book. The first was the structure. So I think this was a really interesting postmodern take on this subject. So basically, the book is a layer of narratives where it's structured around it's supposedly structured around a fictionalized novelization of an essay series written by a fictional Japanese woman author, and then the structure is reminiscent of an academic published work where there is an introduction by the translator of the work, and then several afterwards by characters within the universe, including the author / translator, and then footnotes, at least in the English edition, that come from 3 different sources. So the translator or the author, Yang, then the English translator, and there's a few footnotes from the author of the original work, Aoyama-san. So the main narrative follows a fictional Japanese woman writer, Aoyama-san, as she travels to Taiwan during Taiwan's period of Japanese occupation, and then it's assigned this local translator who is a local Taiwanese woman, and then winds up developing some very strong feelings for her. However, it's a mistake to portray this as a romance. The book explicitly in the introduction from the translator states that to remember that this is a relationship with the colonizer and the colonized, and it's really an interesting way of looking at the power dynamics in play. Besides the very postmodern structure, the book also, even to someone who is completely not well versed in manga, anime, and other works from that genre, I can tell that the influences of works from those genres. The novel itself makes it breaks with the form with the premise in a few places, such as a somewhat anachronistic reference to Yuri. I saw in a review online that these references are a lot stronger in the Mandarin original, which obviously I can't fact check because I don't speak Mandarin, but and that there's been some criticism because of that in Taiwan, that it comes across as very lowbrow, but I actually again found this very characteristic of postmodern work, this blending of highbrow and lowbrow, this using of influences from very transparently lowbrow genres such as anime, such as Yuri, such as video games, and using it to tell a story about colonialism and Japanese occupation of Taiwan. And I think there has been some criticism of the structure. I saw online that apparently people originally thought that this actually was a rediscovered manuscript from a Japanese woman writer, which I also was a little bit confused at first going into it blind, but then I Googled it and also it came up. It was clearly anachronistic intentionally after a few chapters. So I don't think this is, I don't know, a way of tricking the reader or something. I think this was a really cool way of exploring what it means to tell the truth, and who gets to tell the truth, who is doing the truth telling. And in one of the many afterwords, there's actually an allusion to this. I think it is from the translator character who notes, some may say why we didn't choose to present this as a travelogue or a series of essays, but I think they say a novel is a piece of time frozen in amber, is the quote, that it combines truth and fact and emotion. And so then I think the layered narration really asks the question of who gets to tell the truth and who gets to tell the story, because we are served the perspective of the narrator, this Japanese writer, and then there's the implied perspective that you can sometimes sense as a reader, even as a reader who's somewhat ignorant of Taiwan and the history of Japanese colonialism in Taiwan, that the way that she is narrating a sequence of events, that there are clues within the scene that tell you that this is not necessarily how you would interpret them. And then there's the truth revealed to her by different characters, such as the stuffy bureaucrat Mishima-san, that then upends her entire questioning. And then also the framing of it as an academic adjacent work of literature with introductions and afterwards. I think maybe there were too many afterwards. It did get a little bit repetitive after a while. And different layers of footnotes adds to the story, adds to the question of who gets to tell the truth and whose truth is validated. And is it truth if you only get part of the story? And I think also calling into question the way that academic work is often framed and who gets to tell the truth. Because very often, to answer the question of whose truth is seen as the truth, the answer is that of the colonizer. And this is a dynamic that is explored in a very interesting way here. I think being in the viewpoint of someone who is the quote-unquote good colonizer for most of the narrative is it's occasionally very nauseating, because even though Aoyama-san is someone who is makes a big show of going against Japanese racism and going against Japanese imperialism, she still comes across as extremely ignorant. It is still implied in her head that, of course, Japan is more advanced than Taiwan, and that's just something taken as a given. And I thought it was a stroke of genius to have the character who delivers the kind of bolt of reason and the truth nuke, as it were, to be Mishima-san, who is presented as this really stuffy bureaucrat representing the Japanese state, but then turns out that he is, like, I'll put a spoiler alert while editing over there. It turns out that he has a more nuanced relationship with the Japanese state and with Taiwan, and winds up really challenging a lot of what the narrator has seen. I did think at one point he says, there's nothing more difficult to refuse than unwanted goodwill. And this explanation of the very patronizing dynamic that Aoyama-san has with her translator, who she even immediately gives a very infantilizing nickname, Chi-chan, is so interesting. And I mean, when I read it, there were passages where I said, okay, you're kind of beating us over the head here with the fact that this narrative voice is clueless and unreliable. But then I went online and saw that some reviews called this book an apology for colonialism. So I guess it wasn't direct enough. And then the last thing I want to say, and this is something that Aoyama-san gets criticized within the book for, but the premise is she is sent to Taiwan to write a travel narrative, and it is framed around her travel narrative. And that is... But the thing is, like, Aoyama-san is not a very good travel writer. She often avoids going to attractions she thinks are boring, even if they're some of the most important attractions on the island. The only thing she's really interested in is food, and the book goes very in-depth into descriptions of food, to the point that I actually didn't even feel hungry anymore. I just felt a little bit overwhelmed. A lot of it, I think, comes across as somewhat Anthony Bourdain-esque, which I think that creates a really interesting commentary on the modern travel industry. There is this... I'm really curious to see if any Taiwanese people interpreted it this way. This is me just kind of spitballing. I'm really not an expert on this literature or this culture, obviously. But I think that so often now Taiwan, if people know of it in the West, it gets stereotyped as like a street food destination, and that's pretty much all that we think of it. And there are other destinations around the world that get stereotyped, where food is not used as a vehicle for exploring the culture. It is used as a reductive piece of symbolism, and it is fetishized as exotic. It is seen as something brave to go there and try the street food and tell everyone that your stomach could handle it. And I think it serves as a really interesting parody of the modern travel industry, of the modern travel writing industry. Modern travelers who are big on the like, I'm not a tourist, I'm a traveler, man, which with a little bit of rephrasing is pretty much what Aoyama-san says in this book. But no amount of travel philosophy and philosophizing around the way that you move through the world can change the fact that you have the power dynamics between a visitor from a wealthier country and from a potentially even colonized host country. And I think that was a really interesting aspect of the book that I haven't seen explored as much, and makes me think about my own travel habits. My verdict on Taiwan Travelogue is that I think it's really great. I didn't read any of the other books that were shortlisted for the International Booker this year, so I can't say, I think it deserved it or I think it didn't deserve it, but I think it's a good book that people should read and actually discuss. I think there was a lot of discussion about it that maybe wasn't necessarily based on actually reading it. And that's usually a good start when you are going to discuss a book. So that's it for my review for this time, and stay tuned for me trying to get through the actual Booker long list, and let's see if I can actually do any of that. Bye!